On December 16, 1933, the Gestapo noticed and appreciated the work and methods of the Apologetic Center. Thus, Walter Künneth united with Adolf Hitler in the mission to eliminate Jewish influence on the life of the people. At the same time, Künneth sought to permanently rid society of other religious and political minorities. Künneth was really pleased with the Gestapo's interest in his work. This is what he wrote in his report to the leadership of the Reich's Protestant Church. The Gestapo has expressed great interest in the cult archives of the Apologetic Center, as well as our work in combating free thought, Marxism, and Bolshevism. The Gestapo has expressed a desire to lead the fight against illegal free thought alongside the Apologetic Center in the future. The exchange of materials between the Gestapo and the Apologetic Center has already begun.
From this point on, the staff of the Apologetic Center began intensively supplying the Imperial Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Propaganda, and the Gestapo with materials about the political positions of various religious communities. The Apologetic Center also collaborated with the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Goebbels, and the Reich Ministry of the Interior. This work focused on developing materials to combat Jews and cults. Lists of the so-called cults and sects, that is, any groups the Apologetic Center deemed dangerous to state ideology, were maintained and constantly expanded. As a result, representatives of the Apologetic Center, led by Walter Künneth, produced numerous slanderous pseudo-expert reports. This defamation turned these groups, along with the Jews, into targets for the Nazi dictatorship and subsequent brutal persecutions, including the deportation of their members to concentration camps.
Historian Horst Junginger writes, if in 1931 they counted about 150 religious and non-religious ideological communities for which data were collected, and 2 years later about 250, then by 1936 the archival lists recorded about 500 groups and cults considered dangerous. It is also important to note that violent methods that were later demonstrated by the Gestapo both before and during World War II were borrowed from anti-cult organizations, particularly the Apologetic Center organized by the radical part of the Protestant Church. Prototypes of the anti-cult movement have existed since remote antiquity. Persecution and execution of Jesus Christ, establishment of the Inquisition, all of this, and much more, was practiced by the ancient predecessors of modern anti-cultists. Throughout the centuries, they adapted to external circumstances and changed the form, but always maintaining their essence. Their weapon was, and still is, genocide in its various forms. Thus, the radical views of the Apologetic Center were formed long before the radical views of Adolf Hitler himself. Researchers note that Hitler followed Luther's instructions against the Jews precisely. Historians also emphasize that the pre-existing anti-Semitism on the part of the Church determined the character of the German national movements. In other words, it determined Nazism itself. It means that the radical vector against Jews and dissenters was determined long before the Gestapo emerged. It is interesting that in 1933, immediately after its foundation, the Gestapo began to adopt the experience and exchange documentation, precisely with the anti-cult Apologetic Center. Protestant pastors, who held radical views, constantly urged the Gestapo itself to further tighten its methods of combating Jews and dissent. For example, in 1942, the Bavarian evangelical Lutheran pastor, Friedrich Auer, even demanded from the Nazi government another St. Bartholomew's Night, during which no Jew would be spared. It is also interesting that after the war, these pastors were not prosecuted for their Nazi proclamations. Surprisingly, after the war, Walter Künneth was not convicted for his anti-Semitic views and collaboration with the Gestapo, unlike many other Nazis. On the contrary, Künneth received the Maximilian Order for Science and Art and the Bavarian Order of Merit from the Free State of Bavaria. Starting in 1946, Walter Kunneth became a professor of Protestant theology at the University of Erlangen in Bavaria. Kunneth was awarded the honorary title of Church Counselor.
Now you know that it was the anti-cultists who were responsible for making Nazism so violent. They made Nazism such as the world knows it nowadays. Moreover, it was with the hands of the anti-cultists of the past that Nazism was revived after World War II. After the victory over Nazism, the international community united to create the United Nations to maintain and strengthen international peace and security, ensuring that humanity would never again experience the horrors of something like Nazism. At that moment, many believed that Nazism was gone forever. However, in 1964, the Protestant Church of Germany officially reinstated the position of Commissioner for Sects and Ideological Questions of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Bavaria, appointing Pastor Friedrich Wilhelm Hack to the role. He became the successor to Kunneth's Nazi legacy and the leading ideologue of anti-cultism in Europe.
In his studies of sects and cults in Bavaria, Hack referred to the Sektenerhebung, study of sects, conducted by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bavaria in 1930. Here's an interesting fact. Hack studied Protestant theology in Bavaria at the University of Nuremberg, during the same years that Kunneth was a professor of Protestant theology there. At Hack's initiative, the name Working Group on Religious and Ideological Issues from the Nazi regime was revived in the early 1970s. He adopted an almost identical name from the Nazi era, the Department for Religious and Ideological Issues.
All this happened at a time when the world and Germany were trying to live a new, free life, respecting everyone's rights. The flames of Nazism that had engulfed Germany had been extinguished, leaving behind smoldering embers that would have eventually died out on their own, leaving Nazism in the past forever, if not for Hack. He thoroughly rejected the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He rejected what countries, even those that had been enemies, had united for. He rejected the core values accepted by the entire world, values of unity and equality. In his works, Hack declared, if we understand our faith correctly, we have no right to allow the others to continue in their faith. It was on Hack's initiative that lectures and sermons about sectarians and cultists began again in Bavaria, where Nazi ideas had always been powerful. Hack provided instructions that Protestants or Catholics should treat sectarians as subhuman. This reignited the flames of Nazism, and in 1988, 43 years after the fall of the Third Reich, cries were heard once again in Bavaria towards dissenters. Hang them, shoot them all, Heil Hitler. In 1990, the anti-cultist Hack compiled a blacklist of new religious movements, the so-called sects or cults. Only 16 years later did the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany rule that defamation was being used in the fight against these groups. But it was too late, as in those 16 years, the efforts of anti-cultists had already rekindled and spread the flames of Nazism further. Anti-cultists of the past were the forerunners of modern anti-cultists. Anti-cultists never broke the direct line of transmitting their knowledge and methods. Thus, modern anti-cult organizations were established using the model of the Nazi Apologetic Center.
Thus, after World War II, Wilhelm Hack helped his brother in faith, fellow anti-cult activist Johannes Aagaard, establish the Dialogue Center International in Denmark in 1973. Although the center's name suggested peaceful dialogue, it was merely a facade. In reality, Aagaard, like Kunneth in the Apologetic Center, was a Christian anti-cultist who sought to combat so-called totalitarian sects. Aagaard publicly mocked the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a symbol of a free society, calling it a neurosis and claiming it was unnatural to human nature. The Dialogue Center had branches in Greece, England, India, Ireland, Russia, and Germany, where Hawke served as vice president.
And who do you think became one of Agard's favorite students? The student whom Agard would repeatedly defend in courts. You have already heard a lot about him today, but now you will understand where he got all his methods. The Dialogue Center's representative in Russia was Alexander Dvorkin, Hawke's pupil and Agard's favorite student. While in exile, Dvorkin closely collaborated with Hawke, Agard, their follower Pastor Gandau, and other European and American anti-cultists.
Thus, Dvorkin directly and wholeheartedly adopted the Nazi methods, modeling his work on centers aimed at combating all dissenting groups of people. Orthodox Christianity in Russia is now repeating the history of Protestantism in Nazi Germany. During the Nazi era, anti-cultism was introduced into Protestantism through the radical views of Martin Luther, and now, in the same way, Russian anti-cultism, led by Ratzirs, has infiltrated Orthodoxy and is poisoning it from within. History is repeating itself. The Irenaeus of Lyons Center, created by Dvorkin in 1993, under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church, completely mirrors the Nazi apologetic center established by Kunith. This center claims its mission is religious research. Yet, in reality, it acts as a tool of harmful informational propaganda against new religious movements, ideological associations, and even business structures.
Does your center in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus of Lyon currently monitor those networking activities?
Well, of course, we do our best whenever possible. Also, we need to take another stratum into account, that there is a huge number of non-religious cults. I mean, all sorts of personal development trainings.
Commercial ones, so to speak.
Commercial ones as well. They are different. Commercial ones include multi-level marketing organizations, for instance, Amway or Herbalife as the most famous one. Although, again, there are very, very many of them. In fact, those are psycho-cults, I mean pseudo-psychological cults. In other words, all kinds of trainings of personal growth, of increasing inner awareness, how to discover femininity or masculinity in oneself, how to win the hearts of the opposite sex, and many, many various types.
Dvorkin introduces the term totalitarian sect, and like Kunith, conducts lectures and writes articles on the dangers of sects and cults and the rejection of cultists by followers of the dominant religion. Similarly to Kunith and Hawke, Dvorkin compiles lists of totalitarian sects that, in his opinion, threaten religion and the state. In his addresses and lectures, Dvorkin even uses the same rhetoric as the Nazis of the past. For example, Hawke categorically rejected the Declaration of Human Rights as unnecessary. Dvorkin stated that today's weakness in Europe is a direct consequence of replacing its Christian soul with so-called universal values, which, in reality, mean nothing. Do you remember how Kunith said that Judaism represented a foreign cell in Germany's body that needed to be eliminated? Dvorkin claims that
cults bring no benefit to society. We don't know cultists who are writers, artists, music composers, philosophers, and so on. They only drain society of its vital resources. Just like a cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.